a note of gratitude here to Marilyn and Catherine for organizing, for Al for running logistics kind of behind the scenes while still being in front of the scene. It's a mix of both there. And a quick word of gratitude also to my colleague and friend here, Irma, who speaks highly of you all and said that I would actually love to meet you all. And it's actually been a pleasure to meet you all, even though most of it has been virtual. I look forward to also crossing paths in person. Marilyn, thanks for your kind introduction. And I am going to start my stopwatch here, so I have a sense of when 30 minutes ends. If I forget time, be kind enough to remind me. I've prepared a couple of slides for you all, and I want to just walk us through some of these things. As Marilyn said, feel free to introduce your questions via chat, or you can raise hand. We'll also have some time for discussion at the end of the 30 minutes. So we'll say more about that when we get there. But let's get started here, folks. It's good to see you all. Good morning. So this is us, right? This is you all. I have great respect for pastors, chaplains, and congregational leaders. I did that for a little bit before coming to Winnipeg. I did COVID pastoring only for a few months. And we have been in COVID for far too long. So all of you doing pastoral work, chaplaincy work, congregational work, just deep gratitude, deep admiration, and deep encouragement for all of us doing this work. It is sacred work, it's important work, and we are figuring this out really as we go, figuring out what is this new normal. What does it mean to face grief and live with anxiety? So I have prepared two presentations, and I'm going to walk us through the first of the two for now. And do it in the next 30 minutes or so. So let's see what we have here. So the outline for this first presentation is mostly going to focus on emotions. Right? I'm going to start with what we instinctively know about emotions. And maybe I'll talk a little bit about some of the prejudices that surround the area of emotions in general. Then we'll dive into a couple of theological insights, and we'll take a concluding look at a psalm or two, or some insights from the psalm, to then spark discussion in the next 15 minutes after I finish my presentation. So that's the rough plan. It's not in equal parts, but that's the plan. So instinctively, we know this. Instinctively, we know that emotions help us to navigate life. There are things that we love, situations that anger us, moments that move us, events, I'm saying not this one, that bore us. Right? It's possible that I still bore you. It's possible. And a host of other things, right, that are mixed with emotion that affect us. They give us meaning, they give us character. We know this instinctively. We do this on an everyday basis, right? And yet, there are old prejudices with respect to emotions that continue to persist. Now, these might not be prejudices that you share as a person. And for you, I say, may your tribe increase. But my guess is, in our work as chaplains and congregational leaders and pastors, we will encounter these prejudices. If not in ourselves, in our work, we will encounter these prejudices, right? A quick warning here that there's a scary picture in the next slide. So just want to prepare our minds for that. So let's see what we have here. This is where emotions meet old prejudices, right? There are some old, long-standing prejudices when it comes to emotions. I want to share two prejudices here that come up often. One prejudice is that emotions are not rational. So because emotions are not rational, it's better to leave them out. That's one prejudice. Another prejudice that occurs with respect to emotions is that emotions are disruptive of order. It's kind of like that scary picture there to the right? It's a bit disruptive. I don't want that. Can we just do something else? It's too much emotion in the room, right? So that's another kind of prejudice that we have with respect to emotion. Now, what I'm proposing that we think about, right? Not that we should do, that we think about, is that maybe we could move beyond the good versus bad emotions paradigm, right? In other words, emotions are not by default good or bad. They're not necessarily good. They're not necessarily bad. They're something else. And let's talk about what that is. But if we can move beyond this good versus bad emotional paradigm, then where could we get, right? It's a good question to ask. Another thing that I'm proposing that we could consider doing is also to move beyond the idea that emotions are just feelings, right? So what does that mean? It means that emotions have integrity, right? They have a standalone nature that cannot be dismissed, in addition to everything else that constitutes us as human persons, right? So what might it mean for us to make that kind of shift? Will more reading help us to overcome our prejudices? Maybe, maybe not. If only more reading solved the world's problems, right? If only, if only. So I'm going to ask a question here. So maybe we'll take one or two responses. Just unmute and speak if you're able. If you don't speak, don't worry. I won't wait for more than 3 minutes. But I'm going to invite maybe one or two responses here. What's the problem with this Encyclopedia Britannica definition of emotion, according to you? What comes to your mind? This is not like basketball, right? When I played basketball, I was a school substitute, and my coach told me, John, no basket, no points. But I tell in every class, every discussion, there are points for almost every ball that we shoot gets a point. So there are no wrong answers here, but let's see if we have any responses here. What comes to your mind when you look at this definition, right? This definition is this: an emotion is a brief, subjective, behavioral, and physiological response that occurs rapidly when a person is confronted with a situation of great personal significance. It's not a bad definition. It's a limiting definition, right? That's the clue there. But what comes to your mind? Let's take maybe just one or two responses if there are any.
Most emotions last longer than briefly, or they can.
That's a 3-pointer in basketball. That's a 3-pointer. No, exactly, right? Emotions are not these fleeting feelings. They last for a long time on an everyday basis, like we considered. We know this instinctively, we know this, right? So thanks for volunteering that response. I'm going to keep moving here. So the point of this slide is really that even in so-called respectable definitions of emotions, right, there are still limitations that we are going to encounter. So it's a good thing for us to wrap our minds around as chaplains, as pastors, as leaders in congregations. Now, there are other challenges as well with respect to emotions, right? This is one that you are probably already familiar with. This so-called Cartesian dualism, Cartesian coming from the name René Descartes, the French philosopher who famously said, I think, therefore I am. So we have this Cartesian dualism between mind and body, right? And somehow there is this privileging of the mind, of this rational apparatus that is a little more important than one's body, right? And that's unhelpful. That's unhelpful is my proposal here to consider. So if it is unhelpful. And if we are to move beyond this kind of I think, therefore I am idea, can turning to the Bible and theology help? Surprise, surprise, yes, right? So let's see what that is. Now, before I give it away, here's a clue from a Carolina Wren about how the Bible and theology might help us. I'm going to just let that sit for 5 seconds to see if anything registers, and then I'll keep moving. Here's a verse that most of us know by heart. I say it every Sunday morning. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me. Bless God's holy name. It comes from Psalm 103, a very familiar verse to all of us. The word soul is popularly understood with its Greek philosophical connotation as an entity that kind of exists independently of the body, right? Now, you might not share that idea. That's okay. You might have a different understanding of soul. But technically, right, that's the connotation, that the soul has an independent existence even outside of the body. So if people read this word with that kind of idea, what does it mean then? Bless the Lord, O my soul. And here's where looking at the Hebrew helps. It's really interesting. What's interesting is that the Hebrew word that is translated as soul in the English is actually nephesh. And nephesh is best translated, is one of my all-time favorite Hebrew words, is translated as throat, right? Denoting a corporeality, a materiality that is vital to who we are as human persons, or this Carolina Wren, right? Without this throat, without this material throat, without that corporeal nature, there is no way in which the wren could sing, right? Similarly, without our throats, there is no way in which we can sing. There is no way in which we can do what we take for just granted that we can do every day, right? So what we find in the Hebrew Bible in the Old Testament is that actually there's a resistance to this kind of Cartesian dualism. We get this sense in one of the most important theological instructions that the Jews call Shema. And we know this equally well. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart. And notice here, with all your nephesh and with all your might. You see, it's the same word there, nephesh. So there, and this word occurs over 700 times, right? Which means that it actually has a certain value, which resists that Cartesian dualism. There is this connotation that we are to bring our whole selves into community, into worship, into everything that we do, right? And so if you bring our bodies, then here's the trajectory of the presentation, then we bring our emotions as well, right? If we are to love God with all our heart, with all our nephesh and all our strength, then we are to bring our whole selves, including our emotions, to God and to each other, right? Both of those things. Emotions in the Bible, this is again where things get really interesting. In the Old Testament, emotions are not simply what people feel in this or that time, right? They're certainly that. But they're not just that. It's not just what simply people feel in this or that time. Emotions include wide-ranging actions. It's such an interesting thing in the Bible. In short, when dealing with emotions in the Bible, we are dealing with a wide range of emotions and a wide range of actions, all intertwined. I'm going to offer us an example or two here to make sense of that, so it doesn't become all abstract. Abstractness does not help anybody. So let's look at a couple of concrete examples here in the next slide or two. But I want to also give us an overview of how emotions and actions are connected, right? So I won't read all the references here. I hope you can read that. If it's too small, just speak up and let me know. I'll read it also. Organs such as the belly and lips are described as experiencing shaking in scripture. Notice how emotion and action are tied together there. My loins are filled with anguish. There's a physicality to emotion there. Heart and bowels melting due to fear. Right here again, you see the emotion, action intertwining. Losing control of the bladder or bowels as a result of intense fear. Pangs seizing people like the pangs of a woman giving birth. Now, all of these verses, all of these references in scripture are references that we know, right? We know these references. So what I'm encouraging us to do is to register how these references have this really interesting mix between emotion and action. Emotions are actions, in other words, right? They go together. That's the point. I want to give us a couple of narrative kind of examples here. One is, and these I picked intentionally, I picked stories that most of us will be familiar with. Not to say that we are not familiar with other stories, but these are popular stories, right? This comes from Exodus 2. This is when Moses is born and Pharaoh orders all the male babies to be killed. And Moses' mother is scared, right? So look at these set of verses here. So first we have Moses' mother who is scared, who is fearful, and we have an accompanying action there. Moses' mother is scared and she hides Moses for 3 months. Right? So you see the emotion action interface there. Now Moses' sister, Miriam, we know that that is Miriam. Moses' sister stands at a distance to see what would happen to him. This is after Moses' mother hides Moses for 3 months and then places him in a basket and then sends him along the river. Miriam is still presented in the narrative as standing at a distance, but watching, right? Just think for a moment, what might have been Miriam's emotions as she stood there and watched her baby brother float away, right? And then Moses floats, and then we have the daughter of Pharaoh who notices Moses. And the narrative records for us that Moses was crying and Pharaoh's daughter took pity on Moses. Notice the emotion. But that emotion leads to an action. There's an accompanying action, right? So Pharaoh's daughter tells those who see the baby, take this child and nurse it for me and I'll give you your wages. And the story has a super ending because Moses goes back to Moses' mother, right? We know that. But the narrative ends with saying that she named him Moses because she said, I drew him out of the water. In other words, emotions lead to actions. Yes, emotions lead to actions. They seem like two moments, but emotions are also actions, right? So I'd like for us to see emotion and action as two moments sometimes, but also at times one and the same thing, right? That's one example. Another example comes from the story of Jonathan and David and Saul. Saul is the first king of Israel. And Saul is threatened by David. That's part of the context here. So Saul is looking to kill David, essentially. Saul doesn't like the idea that there could be another king other than him, right? We all know how that works in our own time. When people are afraid that they will lose their power, they do nasty things. And so we see Paul here doing something nasty. But in this context, we get a really great image of how action and emotion go together. So let me read the set of verses. But Saul threw his spear at him to strike him. So Jonathan knew that it was the decision of his father to put David to death. Jonathan rose from the table in fierce anger and ate no food on the second day of the month, for he was grieved for David because his father had disgraced him. Notice the emotions here, right? There is anger, there is grief, there is not eating, action, emotion. That's what I'm trying to get at here. That in the scriptural narrative, we have this sense of how emotions and actions go together. They influence each other, right? That emotions are sometimes simply actions. Scripture brings up another interesting question, which is, do we worship an emotional God? So if it's not just persons who are emotional, God is consistently portrayed in scripture in emotional terms. A good example is this, Exodus 34:6-7. This is again a set of verses that we all know well. The Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for the 1,000th generation, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, and yet by no means clearing the guilty, but visiting the iniquity of the parents upon the children and the children's children to the 3rd and 4th generation. Right? Oftentimes people focus on the last part, but the first part is equally important, if not more, that God's love, mercy, grace abounds for hundreds of generations, right? We get this notion of how God might even be emotional, the sense of having mercy, in the sense of having grace, in the sense of being slow to anger, in the sense of leading with love, with steadfast love, right? The question of God being emotional. We are coming to the end here, and I'm going to look at my time. We're doing okay. Before we call it the end of presentation 1, I want to maybe look at a thing or two with you from the Psalms. Now, what we find in the Psalms is very, very interesting. We have almost every possible thing that we could imagine with respect to emotion in the Psalms. In the Psalms, we see how the psalmist expresses God's closeness, also expressing God's distance in anxious times, right? So it's times of anxiety, and in times of anxiety, the psalmist expresses God's closeness, but the psalmist also expresses God's distance, right? So on the one hand, in Psalm 22, for instance, we have, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me, from the words of my groaning? Here is this notion that God is far. Why are you so far away, God? Why have you forsaken me? So this is the expression of God being distant, right? And in other places, for instance, like Psalm 34, verse 18, the psalmist is saying, the Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit. Notice that in both verses, right, in both the Psalms, the anxious times are in the center, right? Anxiety is still at the center in both of those things. But in one, God is presented as being near. In the other, God is presented as being far. Now, what I'd like for us to consider is not to see these two things as an either-or situation. In other words, as we engage each other in pastoral work, in congregational work, chaplaincy work, is to consider holding both of these kinds of approaches as a both and rather than an either or, right? In other words, we might want to consider not saying God is only far and that's it, or God is only near and that's it. What the Psalms allow us to do is to express that sometimes God does seem far. At other times, God does seem near in a situation of anxiety. What might it mean for us as people to hold both of those expressions about God's presence in our lives together at the same time? A both and approach rather than an either or approach. The Psalms are also interesting because feelings like rage are expressed. Now, this is not a happy example from Psalm 137. And this is the context of anger against those responsible for destruction and exile. people are saying in their congregational settings. They're remembering how their enemies said, tear it down to its foundations. They're referring to the destruction of the temple. And they are saying, happy shall they be who pay you back for what you have done to us. I'm not going to read the rest of the words there. We'll just let that be. We know these set of verses. It's not a happy example. But what I'd like for us to notice here is that these feelings, even of rage, are recorded in scripture for us. But what's fascinating and what's important, I think, for us to wrap our minds around is that it actually occurs in the context of a gathered community. In other words, in the community, the community acts as a holding space for expressing care, for embodying care in such a way that every emotion is allowed to be expressed in the context of a community, right? So then it brings up this big question about what might it mean for us to allow the whole range of human emotions to be expressed in community. We have God in the Psalms presented in such an evocative way, right? The psalmist says, God, you have kept count of my tossings. You have put my tears in your bottle. Are they not in your record? God is presented as remembering our sufferings, remembering our anxious times, right? That it's not forgotten, right? God just doesn't see, but God almost collects them in a bottle, keeps them in a record, returns to that as a way of drawing close to us. That's the sense that we get of God in the Psalms. So finally, this is what I'd like for us to consider. The Psalms are a collection of prayers, songs, liturgical elements. They're used in the context of a gathered community. And in this context of a gathered community, every emotion one could possibly think of was brought to the common table, as it were. It therefore offered persons the freedom and capacity to ask, what language shall I borrow to give expression to what I am feeling today? Right? So the final thought here for our consideration is, as we look at scripture, as we look at the Psalms, as we look at this full range of emotion being recorded for us, being presented as having integrity, and as we live in our own anxious times, what might it mean to look at these words, to look at these kind of theological motives, to ask, what language shall I borrow today to give expression to what I am feeling today, to what we are feeling today, to what others are feeling today? And that's the final thought, folks, that I want to leave with us. So I'm going to stop sharing here and invite your thoughts and comments and questions. I think we have an idea for how we might do this. So let me pause to see if our moderators want to say something, or should I just offer a suggestion for how we might spark some conversation here in the next 15 minutes?
Yes, John, why don't you, we'll look to you. Yeah.
Okay, super. So folks, here's what we're going to do. Let's come back with our questions. What happens sometimes after a presentation, especially in a large group, is that's a lot of information. So how are we going to process that, right? So what we're going to do is take quickly 5 minutes, right? 5 minutes, like literally 5 minutes, right? So it's going to be a rapid round in your virtual circle. So what we'll do is we'll do breakout rooms, and Al will help us with that. When you find yourself in a breakout room, just join a breakout room and you see the invitation to join a breakout room. And in your breakout room, quickly go around, right? Take about like 30 seconds each or so. Just go around and make sure you collect a set of impressions from everybody in your virtual circle, and have someone kind of represent your discussion When we come back, we'll maybe ask for the folks you have chosen to represent your discussion to quickly name some things that are coming up for you in your small groups. And then we'll have about 10 minutes to see what to do with those responses. I'll offer some reactions. And my guess is there is a lot of wisdom in this room, so we can respond to each other as well. So that's what we'll do, folks. So hang in there, 5 minutes. We'll come back in 5 minutes to go around quickly in your small group, come back with your reactions and have someone report back. Hey everybody, welcome back. People usually have a few seconds to join back. So let's just give them a few seconds here. Is everyone back? I guess all groups are
I think
back.
we're close. There's 57 back. I think that's about right.
Okay.
So I think Al is going to, I don't know, or John, you can moderate however you, John, why don't you moderate?
Okay, super. So let me quickly check with Al and Catherine here. In terms of time, are we good till the next 10 minutes? Are we good for 10 minutes?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay. All right, folks. So we had a few groups. So if you're reporting back from your group, would you be so kind as to just unmute and just share what came up for you in your group? And what we'll do is we'll just collect a set of impressions. And as folks are talking, just listen to what other people are saying, just register that. I'll have a response or two perhaps, and then we can talk to each other, see where the conversation leads us. Could one of you volunteer to be first, and then we'll take the others in the order that we get them. So just unmute and speak if you're representing your group. And if you didn't pick a person to represent your group, you can be that person now.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
My name is Marlene, and I was in group 4, and I think we have a number of questions. We do. First question, is the church a safe place for anger? And if, as it says in Psalms, all emotions have validity, does anger have validity and a place in church? Because we felt that anger tends to be seen negatively. Second question, what are the gender dynamics? What is allowed? Is anger allowed? Is sadness allowed? Some emotions are allowed to 1 or 2 different genders, like gender dynamics regarding emotions. And question number 3, what is the connection between emotions and actions? Which actions are appropriate and which are not appropriate ways of expressing what we are feeling? That's it.
Thanks, Marlene, for a great start. Let me just quickly say, this is the kind, if this were a class, it's not, but if this were a class, the grade you would get for participation is A+. But thanks for a great start. Thanks for a great start. Let's respond to questions. I'll just save that for a little bit. Let's collect the rest of the responses. Let's see what else is coming up for people. Others, go ahead.
Well, I was in group 7, and a few of us had a question about your comment that emotions are actions. We weren't quite sure because we think that there's a gap between an emotion and an action, that emotion is something that wells up and can provoke one to action, but one has a choice about what one does. And so we weren't sure what you were meaning by that.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Scott.
I'm Louise.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
Louise from group 6. Anger was one of the issues too. Are Mennonites uncomfortable? Do we have an uncomfortable relationship with anger? Seldom it's raised in church. Perhaps we think emotions are fine with children, but by the time we become adults, maybe we're not maybe we have a prejudice for adults not having emotions. Is choosing positive emotions in a difficult time a courageous act? How do we know if it's healthy or an unhealthy response? Those are a few of our highlights.
All right, folks, these are all here again, all A+. This is super. Go ahead, folks. Let's see what else is coming up for people. Go ahead, Nancy.
So I'm reporting on my group. I'm not sure which number I was. I'm sorry. So a couple of things that we brought out. We talked about culture and how different cultures and maybe just different personalities are very expressive, very reticent, or somewhere in between. And how do we navigate those various expressions of emotion in our communities? And that, so that was part of the concern. A question we raised too is, how do we provide that space as a community when we're not allowed to gather? And with the current restrictions, how do we create that space, that community embodiment, as you talked about? Another thing we talked about is finding language to give expression to our emotions that doesn't become harmful language. And that's something that we see also, is that finding the words to express our emotions without doing harm through that. And we also, as other people have talked about, some emotions being more acceptable than others.
Thanks, Nancy. Super. That was great.
Gary, reporting for Group 1. We wondered about the idea of God being both near and far. We wondered if, even though we feel God is far, does that make God far? Or is God actually near? We noted how, as you're saying, emotions affect all of our lives. We are our minds and our emotions. Our minds and emotions are not just something that possess us. That is who we are. And it was noted there's great value in confession, letting out the angst, physical in a public way, perhaps, even as it's done in some cultures where congregations will all confess their sins together, not listening in on each other, but all talking to God about confessing, and then that is a real release of anxiety for people.
Thanks, Gary. That was great. Thank you.
I'm Donna from Group 2. We didn't assign a reporter, so I hope it's okay with the rest of the group that I report. But we did find that the Psalms are a helpful reminder of the language that God uses in combining emotion with action. As someone who has studied worldview, I'm just wondering if in our Western society, we've carried through that philosophy of Stoicism, separating the physical from the emotional, or soul from spirit and body. So how do we carry that forward into ministry, whether it's in spiritual care, creating a space for people to receive emotional healing, as well as physical healing. Also in chaplaincy, what do we do by just listening to that person's emotions? And I suppose I did address the question, although our breakout room was returning back to the main session, is as those people, whether it's pastors, chaplains, people in ministry, what do we do with those emotions by listening to people?
Thanks, Donna. That was fantastic, and thanks for volunteering to go, even though your group didn't choose a person. That's A++.
Okay.
No, that was great. No, these are super questions. We'll come to them once we collect everything else here. Other groups, go ahead.
Our group also didn't request a presenter, so I'll just volunteer. I don't remember everything we said, but I do know that we appreciated how the Psalms' various language validates our emotional experiences, and as you had said, gives language for us to express those. But so much of our experience in churches has been that there isn't really space or permission to express some of those stronger negative emotions. And so I asked the question, have we ever experienced a situation where as a congregation, we were expressing rage and anger together in a mob kind of environment, or is that too dangerous an experience?
Great questions there. Thanks, Stephen. And thanks again for volunteering to go, even though that you did not choose a person. That's great. Other groups?
That might be all of them. I think there were 9 groups.
Okay.
So I didn't keep count, but we've had.
That's okay. Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, don't be startled by my silence. But folks, this is great. This is really, really great. So there are a couple of questions that are coming up, right? One is, do we as church communities, as faith communities, allow for the full expression of all the emotions? What's already coming up from your questions is that sometimes we do and sometimes we don't, right? And in the times that we don't, could we? And we could. So you're kind of rhetorically responding to your own questions. It's coming up more than one in more than one group, right? The gender dynamics is a super, super important question. I'm so glad that you're asking the question. Oftentimes in faith communities, this is what I've noticed. What you have noticed might be different, and I'd love to hear what you all have to say. What I've noticed is, I know the emotion anger is coming up for a few groups. What I've noticed, especially with respect to genders, I'm going to use my response regarding anger to talk about gender dynamics, is oftentimes in faith communities and even other communities, including other political communities, anger is okay for men to possess. If a man is angry in front of the mic, that's okay. That's okay. He was just passionate. He made a passionate plea. That was so great. What a passionate and wonderful speech that was. It was so moving, right? Just same words, same tone, replace the man with a woman. You have a completely different set of reactions to the same thing. This has been my experience. If you have different experiences, you should tell me, right? If the woman does the same thing, they'd say, what's wrong with her? She should take it a notch down, right? There's too much emotion in the room. That's why it's good to bracket emotions. Can't we just discuss this like rational people? Why should we bring emotions in? So you see how when you bring the gender lens, already we are finding a contradiction. There is a contradiction, right? So the contradiction then allows us to realize that sometimes gender comes in the way of fuller expression of emotions, right? And it should not, perhaps should not. Should it? I don't think so, right? But you see how gender comes in the way, right? Let me see. I know we're kind of here at the end of our time here. And folks, let me say this. Let me see if I have maybe one more response to something else here as I look at my notes. But before I do that, let me say this. So we will be taking a break, right? And then Catherine and Al will say more about how that looks. When we come back for our second presentation, we will do this again, right? Where we have 15 minutes of discussion. We could do a 5-minute of rapid round like what you did, come back and gather impressions. And what we'll do at the very end before we close is we'll have an open-ended prompt or two that we will offer, where we'll have more time for discussion. And when we come back collectively at that point, there will be much more time than just simply 10 minutes. So if something is not addressed now, we could return to that later. And by all means, you could say something like, hey, we'd love to get some thinking going around that topic, theme, question. So absolutely, we can do that. I feel like maybe I should look at my notes and see if I have responses a little later so that we can keep going ahead with our time logistics. So let me pause now and hand over the mic, as it were, to other folks here.
All right. Marilyn, go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Katja.
Okay. We will pause for a short break, grab another coffee, tea, water, or I don't know, stretch out. And then we will meet again in about 10 minutes. So 10. At about 10:05, I will start just a video, and you can take that moment to just relax or just be. So we will see you in 10 minutes.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to session 2. So what I'm going to do similarly here is to shift gears. I was hoping to get into Jesus's wounds in presentation 1. And I thought that was changing too many gears. So we're going to change that gear here. And that being said, this is also a change in gear in the sense that there will be some continuity with the last presentation, but new things might come up for us. So don't let that be a confusing thing. So the questions that came up during presentation 1, let's return to that even after presentation 2, and we'll have again more time to discuss even after we come back from our next break. So hold on, folks. So let me get situated here. All righty. All right, there we are. So everybody can see the slide and hear me, see me, all that is good. So we are in presentation 2 of 2. So we are 50% of the way. So congratulations and hold on, folks. So this is a sobering statistic, and it is one that we are familiar with. And I wanted to introduce that briefly here to allow us to emotionally register the weight of the pandemic that we are still in the middle of, folks. This has been a long, long time with terrible losses and great anxieties. The World Health Organization reports that the number of persons who have died due to the pandemic is now over 5.5 million. That is just an extraordinarily huge number. It is a sobering number, and that is the amount of loss that we are still journeying with. This is a lot to shoulder for anyone. If the pandemic has taught us one thing, it has taught us that this is an extraordinary weight to bear, an extraordinary weight in ways that we realize and in ways that we don't. And I just wanted to offer the statistic to register that weight. What this time has made us see is that there are pandemic-related deaths that are heart-stopping, right? Over 5.5 million. And in this last year or two, we have also encountered, in addition to all of these extraordinary losses, just untimely deaths, unjust losses, right? And all this these things have been really brought to the center of our imagination. So what I'm going to propose is we will look at some content, but I want us to also register these things, right? That this is a time of extraordinary loss in more ways than one, right? More ways than one. We have the pandemic, the weight of it, and then we have all these other untimely, unjust deaths and losses. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce 2 slides after this. And what I'm going to invite us to do is to emotionally register these moments, right? I'm going to maybe give us like 20 seconds for each of the next 2 slides. And I'm going to invite us to just emotionally register these things and just pause, reflect, feel encouraged to recall the name of a person, the name of a place, a situation in a mood of prayer, right? That's my invitation to you all as I change the next 2 slides. And then I'll also invite us to briefly have a moment of silence after that. But the next 2 slides, I'm going to pause for 20 seconds for us to register. Just recall names, places, situations in a mood of prayer. Thanks everyone for participating in that. It really is an extraordinary time that we are living in. People use the word unprecedented for a lot of things, but this is one situation we are living in that is really unprecedented. We have not faced anything like this in our lifetimes, not a single one of us. This kind of pandemic has not hit us like this in our lifetimes. So we have nothing to compare this with, right? That brings about another kind of anxiety, the kind of anxiety for which we do not have precedent, right? If we have a bad snow day, we know what that is because there is precedent. So we know kind of what to do, right? But a pandemic is not like that. Pandemic is not like that. And the kind of losses that we're dealing with are not like that. So I just want to acknowledge the extraordinary weight of the situation that we are living in, folks. So thanks for participating in that. Here is an icon, a representation of Jesus and Jesus's wounds. This is, so I don't want to save this till the end because this is really what I want us to consider. If there is one takeaway from the second presentation, this is what I'd like for us to think about, right? What does it mean for us to believe in a Jesus whose wounds continue to exist? The scars of the wounds continue to exist even in the post-resurrection life, right? When we go to our more broader discussion after the second session, we'll have a break and then we'll have another discussion. At that point, I'll bring up this question again and I'll have a prompt for our discussion at that point. But what I'd like for us to register here in this slide is that in the biblical witness, Jesus's wounds, there's an apostrophe missing there, continue to remain after the resurrection. This physical memory of loss engenders an accompanying theological register. Now, this is where there's an implication for us as pastors, church leaders, congregational leaders, chaplains. This has a theological register that we could perhaps engage more, right? My guess is we are already engaging with this. So I am not going to make the claim that we are not engaging with this. How is that possible? We are engaging with this in our own way. We are doing this. Here's an invitation for us to think about engaging this all the more. What does it mean for us as Christians to read the Bible, to encounter Jesus, to believe Jesus, who continues to journey even in the post-resurrection life with the scars of his wounds, right? What does that possibly mean for us? What could it mean for us? The enormity of the world's grief and its wounded nature makes even the most determined and optimistic people tired, right? So then what do we do? What do we do in that kind of situation? I want to start by maybe encouraging us to think about what we need not do or what we should not do. And here again, folks, this is, I hope you don't hear this as me saying this is what you're not doing, right? But this is simply an encouragement for all of us to maybe think about this as one thing we could perhaps resist in our respective fields of work and ministry and vocation. That death and loss and suffering cannot be theologized. That's the claim I want to make. So the claim I want to make is that death and loss and suffering cannot be theologized. Perhaps I should choose a different word and maybe just say should not be theologized. It can be theologized. Should we? I think we should not. So that's my proposal. It's a strong claim, but I'm going to make it to see what thoughts it prompts for us. The thought here being that death and loss should not be theologized. And what I'm basing this on is simply the fact that in scripture, we find a theological opposition to death. Now, Abraham, Sarah, Hagar, Isaac, Ishmael, and other major characters of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, did not believe in life after death. This sometimes comes as a surprise to some of us, but they simply did not believe in life after death. The life that they knew, the life that they believed in, was the life before death. The death that they knew was final. Now, of course, as readers of Christian scripture, we are reading scripture from 2022. So we have a slightly different perspective. We are looking back, right? When we look back, we have the luxury of time. We have the luxury of perspective that gives us a certain privilege. But from that time when they looked forward, the people of the Torah, all the characters of the first 5 books of the Bible, for them, life as they knew it was the only life they believed in. Death was final. It was only in the later context of extreme injustice and tyranny of powerful empires that a belief in an afterlife began to emerge. Now, that is just something to remember, right? Just something to remember. What might it mean for us then to rewind a little bit? Maybe place our lives and situations in a kind of contemporaneous way. Imagine ourselves hanging out with Abraham and Sarah and Hagar and Isaac and Ishmael. What might it mean for us to then think about death or to theologize or not about death and loss? A theological opposition to death may even be found in the lectionary kind of readings that we have in churches. For instance, Psalm 30. In Psalm 39, the psalmist asks, "What profit is there in my death? If I go down to the pit, will the dust praise you? Will it tell of your faithfulness?" So you see here again how we get the sense of, for the psalmist here, death is final. For the psalmist here, death is final, and the psalmist is calling on God to be of help. Because if God does not help the psalmist when the psalmist is still alive, what profit is there in death? How will the dead tell of your faithfulness? How will the dust praise you? Death is final here. What one sees here is the psalmist's challenge and plea to God to do something when there is still time in this life, on this side of death, right? And as we ask the question, how can we theologize death? Should we theologize death? We can in turn, like the psalmist, offer this plea to each other, to form bonds of community, to form bonds of solidarity with those who are suffering loss in our own time. And oftentimes it might be ourselves, right? It might be us who are journeying with loss. It might be somebody else we're meeting who's journeying with loss. What might it mean for us to form bonds of community and solidarity when we still have time, right? Imagine a world in which we stop at every news of death. Just want us to just imagine that world for a minute. Can we imagine a world in which we stop at every news of death? Sometimes I wonder if this system that we are living in is conditioning us to keep moving on. Death, yeah, stops us, but we still move on. Stops us, and then we move on. Stops us, and then we move on. We say, oh, that was 2020, that happened in 2020, we are good in 2021. Or that happened in 2021, we are good in 2022. What might it mean for us to register what happened in a current moment and allow us to just stop, and then allow such situations to help us come together as communities of faith to re-envision and reorder our lives? This is our opportunity, I think, as we live in anxious times, to reorder our lives, to re-envision our communities. This is the opportunity that I'd like for us to consider. A community constantly reordered by loss is not a new idea, right? This is not John Boopalan's idea, right? This is not a new idea. A community that is constantly reordered by loss is the kind of community that we read about in Scripture. It is precisely this kind of community that is held as a beacon of light for us, right? In the Torah, again, the people of Israel are exhorted, encouraged to remember that they were slaves in Egypt. Who would offer such a reminder? Hey, remember you were slaves in Egypt. Remember you were slaves in Egypt. For what? For what? Because that kind of remembrance has implications for the present, right? Now we know this. This again is just like emotions, isn't it? We instinctively know this. We read this in Scripture all the time. This is simply an opportunity for us to register and to ask ourselves, how might we be a community in our own anxious times to be constantly reordered by loss? Reordered by loss in a present continuous mode, right? Not in this kind of linear mode where you just kind of go on and on. So in Leviticus 19:34, for instance, the people are exhorted with this message: "You shall love the alien as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt." In the same chapter, verses 6 and 7, this is same tone in Isaiah, picking up from Leviticus 19 and saying the same thing. "It is not this the fast that I choose, to loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke. Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover them and not to hide yourself from your own. Right? These are things that we know, but the point I want to emphasize is simply that it is the memory of being slaves in Egypt that allows them to embody this posture of hospitality and solidarity, right? It is dependent on the former. The solidarity and the hospitality is dependent on the memory of slavery in Egypt, right? In other words, what I'm asking for us to consider anew is to allow loss, death, suffering to constantly reorder us to be better selves, to be better communities, to form bonds of solidarity, to form bonds of love. That is our opportunity, I think. Some questions here. This pandemic ignited by COVID-19 has just jolted the world. Our daily rhythms have been thrown out of sync, and we've been forced to become observers of the cultures we have created and or inhabit, right? If that is our opportunity to be observers of the cultures that we either create or inhabit, what are our observations? What will we tell about ourselves? What will we say? Will we say, hey, I've noticed that this is happening in our community. I'm noticing that this is happening in my church. It's an opportunity for us to observe. Observe in order to reorder and re-envision, right? This observation has been forced on us, but I'm asking the question, instead of seeing it as being forced on us, can we go one step forward and say, no, we are going to embrace this opportunity to intentionally observe what's going on, what's coming up for us, and to allow that to reorder and re-envision. Now, human persons are certainly bonded by a shared creatureliness that makes us dependent on each other. What unites us, in other words, what I'm saying is that what unites us is our bodies, our creatureliness, our losses, our deaths, our suffering. And how might such mutual bodily dependence help us to form bonds of solidarity, not only during this pandemic, but also beyond? What might it mean for us to think about that? Now, here's the trigger warning, folks. The next slide is a slide on the lighter side of things. And some of you might not find this amusing, but bear with me. So I'm going to persist nevertheless here. This is a picture that comes from my daughter's book on dinosaurs. And this is a case study about a dinosaur called the oviraptor. Now, as the slide shows us here, oviraptor, I clicked this picture this morning, right? As my daughter was still sleeping, I sneaked out of the home. But oviraptor means egg hunter, right? So they thought this dinosaur was an egg hunter because they found the fossil next to the egg. So they thought they was trying to hunt the egg. So they named it oviraptor, egg hunter. And so the small dinosaur was given its name because its bones were found among eggs. And at first, people thought that the dinosaur must have been stealing them to eat them, right? Now, what in fact it was doing was it was protecting its eggs. Now, what they discovered was that this dinosaur is in fact protecting its eggs and died doing so. Every day, at least for a good 20 minutes in the last 2 weeks, my daughter has been asking why, right? And it has been a great opportunity for me to talk to her about kindness, that sometimes kindness can be costly, that sometimes care for other people can be costly, that it costs us. Yes, care and kindness are great things. They're positive things, but they're also costly, right? So here is the oviraptor that was misnamed because it was misunderstood, but it died protecting its young. Long before humans came onto the scene, we see that caring for others is part of the DNA of living, breathing things, right? That's what I want us to register here. That this DNA is something that we have inherited as well. I'm not saying necessarily from the dinosaurs. That's not my point here, that we have inherited care from the dinosaurs, because we know that there are the nasty ones, right? Simply in our emotional registers for now, let us register that care, kindness are long-standing affects. Care for others, especially for those who are vulnerable. These are long-standing affects. I'm aware that I'm speaking to an enlightened audience, right? So I don't want to be unaware of that. I'm very aware of that. So briefly, I'll only note that from the earliest times, and I have a link here with more information that I will not get into right now, but from the earliest times, right, geneticists, archaeologists are telling us that humans, from the earliest times humans appeared on Earth, there is evidence that they cared for those with physical and mental vulnerabilities. I find that very moving. When you get a chance, I'll share the slides with you all later. When you get a chance, go to that link. Just give that a read. It's emotionally moving to know that we are not the first ones to think about what it means to care for others. Those who have gone before us have done this. The characters in the biblical witness have done this. The stories in the Bible remind us of this, right? That we can, and that we should, and that this is an opportunity to do that. Right? Crises like the pandemic have a way of revealing deep fractures in our societies, right? And if they do, in fact, reveal such deep fractures, then these kinds of times might be, for those of us with open hearts, moments of reckoning, right? And as I say, they are moments of reckoning. Instead of freezing us in states of guilt, how might we allow such moments of reckoning to move us? Not freeze us, but to move us towards creating, sustaining, and furthering habits, structures that lift up and privilege those who are most vulnerable. What can we do? What can we do? And here's where I'm going to simply say, we can attend to wounds and we can attend to anxiety. One story, just to have a concrete point of reference here, is the story of Elijah. Now, Elijah, as we know, challenges King Ahab and Jezebel, 1 Kings chapter 19. Ahab decides to kill Elijah, so Elijah runs. And what I'm going to propose here is that we can actually take the figure of Elijah as a placeholder for those of us who are anxious and looking for positive change in the world, right? And if we put ourselves in Elijah's shoes, what we encounter in the story is that divine figures, angels, encounter Elijah in his desperate state and provide food and nourishment. They provide food, they provide nourishment. When Elijah is tired, afraid, and ready to give up, an angel appears and says, "Get up and eat. Otherwise, the journey will be too much for you." It is in the context of Elijah saying, "I have had enough." Elijah is saying, "I have had enough." Isn't that sometimes our own voices too? I have had enough. I certainly hear that in my head. I have had enough. And when we hear that voice in our head, what might it mean for us to depend on each other for food and for encouragement, for nourishment, for bonds of love and solidarity, right? Divine help comes through a whisper to Elijah, "Get up and eat." That's one help for us. Divine help comes from divine, but divine help is also divine in the sense that all help is divine. All help is divine, right? I want to stop sharing there and and see how we are doing on time here. Let me look at my stopwatch here. I think we're coming closer to our time here, folks. So I'm going to propose that we do what we did last time. Sometimes these presentations can come like it's like a speeding train that comes to a sudden halt. So if you're feeling like that, just allow yourselves to pause for a moment, and let's do small groups. We'll do similarly small groups like last time. What we'll do in the first 5 minutes is just like what you did, and you've already done this fantastically well, so I won't say anything more than do the same thing, right? Do the same thing. First 5 minutes, rapid round, get a set of impressions, and have people report back, and then let's see how we are doing, what's coming up for us, and then we'll take it from there. We'll have more opportunity for conversation again after a break, but for now, let's pause and do small groups. Let's start with 5 minutes. At the 5-minute mark, we'll come back and let's see what's coming up for us. Folks. All right, folks, welcome back. I think that's all of us, I think. So welcome back. Hope you had some time to get some thoughts on the table, as it were, the virtual table. So if you are representing your group, just reporting back, just go ahead and unmute yourself and share what's coming up for you. And let's do a round of that like we did last time. And then we have time till about 10:45. So that goes by pretty quickly. So go ahead, folks.
I'll report on group 8. We appreciated your invitation to think of the crisis of the pandemic as an opportunity, especially as it re-identifies us. And one instance was named that when we as Canadians find or re-find 215 graves, it shatters our sense of identity and calls us to re-identify. Another contribution was that we wondered whether more could be said about theologizing death. I think we understood that death and suffering should not be dismissed. Can it be theologized in a good way? What's the term theologized mean? And then further, there were some second thoughts and questions about understandings of afterlife in the Old Testament. Job's "I know that my Redeemer liveth," and Isaiah 4 was another reference given. So there was some discussion about what forms of thought about afterlife existed already in Old Testament scriptures.
Thanks, Tim. That was fantastic. Let's get everybody else's thoughts.
We talked a fair bit about what it means to just stop when there is a loss, and the image of when driving to a cemetery and the cars pull over, cars who aren't involved in the funeral, how profound that is, and how there is a shift in our culture where not everybody does that anymore. And what does that mean? We want to make meaning out of our loss and suffering. So again, the question about theologizing. Where do we go with grief when there is no funeral? And Old Testament too. Abraham was trusting God when he took Isaac to that hill or to the bush, and so yeah, wondering about the Old Testament and no belief in afterlife.
Thank you, Maria. Others, go ahead.
Group 4. We talked about revealing the fractures and injustices of society, and how we wondered that there are so many structures which are set up to benefit us from others. Then we also talked about survival of the fittest, And we wondered how much we have imbibed of this. Have we, how, to what degree? Someone mentioned that speaking sociologically, it has shown that goodness and solidarity emerge when there are times of suffering and trauma. And to what degree is this also true? Communities, do we need to seek out our suffering from the past? Or is it there? Is it part of who we are? Do we have to keep revisiting it? Or is it simply who it is we are as humans?
Fantastic. Thank you. I am busy making notes here, so this is great, you all. Keep it coming. Let's go to the next group.
I'm reporting for group 5. One comment that was that you said all help is divine, and particularly during this COVID time, that's exponentially so, that our kindness to each other can be even more powerful. We talked about feeling overwhelmed, feeling guilty, maybe if we know other people are suffering more than we are, and feeling paralyzed or frozen, unable to respond. And even the most optimistic and most helpful people are getting tired. We talked about all of that, and then talked about keeping in mind that we are not in control, and resting in that knowledge. Be still and know that I am God. And then I'll just jump in here with my own stuff. So having lived many years in West Africa and watching people there cope with crises when they didn't have the financial resources and they didn't have the kinds of sense of control that we have here, and seeing the resilience that they have in those moments, and wondering how we can embrace that. Two powerful things: being more community minded than individualistic. And so drawing on our strength as community rather than trying to be strong as individuals. And secondly, drawing on our power that comes from our spiritual resources, prayer, trusting in God, that we have also put less faith in because we've put so much faith in our financial and other resources. So I think that finding resilience comes from going back to that knowledge that we're not in control, but trusting that that we don't have to be all powerful, that we can be powerful together and with God.
Thank you, Nancy. That was great. Others?
Group 1 was struck by the fact that Christ still carried his wounds. And what does it mean for us that we still carry wounds? What does it mean that our congregations still carry wounds and some of the traumas and suffering people have experienced? And we hope that loss and suffering can give us the compassion and ability to help the most vulnerable people.
Thanks, Gary. Others?
I'm calling from group
Group
9.
2. Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
Oh, go ahead.
We acknowledge that it's been a tough couple of years, and it's good to remember that while we pastors and leaders are always trying to look at what good can come out of this and where we're going to go with it all, the need to acknowledge we've been slogging through mud and mire, and that there's a weight to that that's hard to bear. We talked about Jesus's woundedness as well. And the image for me that I'm reminded of is in adoptive family literature. We often talk about our children as having been born with a primal wound when they were separated from their birth families, and that as adoptive families, our role is to help children grow to be strong enough to bear that scar. That scar will always be there, and it doesn't necessarily have to be painful or debilitating, but that they will have to grow to bear the weight of that wound. And I think that's a helpful image in churches when they're recovering from crises, or when they're recovering from deep sorrow, is that we're growing together to be able to bear a scar that is sometimes evident, but doesn't have to be painful and debilitating in the long run.
Thank you, Tosha. And am I seeing your name right? Is it Tosha? Yeah, thanks, Tosha. Donna, go ahead.
Hi. So in group 2, we focused on the question of not theologizing death and what kind of implications that has from a New Testament gospel perspective. Again, you know, how we read or interpret scripture holistically, not just focusing on Old Testament, but bringing the New Testament scriptures. And I guess I think of scriptures in particular where Jesus wept, and the painful emotion that he carried, not just the physical wounds, but the emotional as well. So we talked about that. And again, we looked at the observations of culture. What have we observed during the pandemic? And there seems to be an overwhelming apathy of people towards other people's situations. And maybe it's just that we don't want to feel the pain of that situation, or that death, or that loss, or job loss, or the way that we view anti-maskers, pro-maskers. So we notice that kind of low tolerance, but how do we in ministry continue to be present to those who have experienced loss and help them process that loss? And not only process the loss, but how does that reflect back on our own lives? As you mentioned, you know, that the people of Egypt remember the time of slavery they had, but what about children that have known nothing different except this kind of time? How are they processing the loss of their friendships and the mental health problems that are occurring through that? So it was a lot of good thought coming out of the group.
Thanks, Donna. Indeed, I'll second that for you. Other groups, are there others who have not yet gone? So that's all of us then. Looking at the time, I feel like I should say to those running logistics that I should probably stop talking and hand over the mic so we can keep going with what we need to go with. I'll just say this one thing. I knew that there would be wisdom in this group, and in your group discussions, that is just so clearly evident. And as you're listening to each of your other group participants kind of sharing their impressions, I hope you're receiving some of that wisdom, right? There's so much wisdom going around in this circle. What I'm going to do now is I don't think we have the time to respond in particular. So we're going to pause for now and hand over things to logistical folks who will say a thing or two about what the next few moments are going to look like. When we come back, I'll have a prompt or two, and then by all means, let's return to these questions. We'll have more time for discussion at that point. So over to you, Al and Catherine and Marilyn.
All right, let's take a 10-minute break back at 11:10. And I think at 11:05, there's another video that will play as you come back. So have a good bio stretch break.
Here, I will offer one reminder / encouragement, right? I'll do that. And I'll suggest 2 prompts for our discussion. Now, these are suggestions, which means that if you don't do that, that's okay, right? So maybe something else came up for you in your previous conversation and you just want to return to that, that's all well and good, right? For those who find the prompts helpful, by all means, go with the prompts, right? Go with the flow, as it were. But if something else is coming up for you, if there is a question or a comment that somebody else made that you'd like to return to, just bring that back into discussion. We actually have a good chunk of time to do this, but time does fly, like my daughter reminds me every day. So I'm going to jump right in, folks. This is going to be brief. I should not take more than 5 minutes. And if I do, somebody stop me. Hold on. All righty. Okay, so this is a small and large group discussion we are going to enter into. So this time around, what we'll do is, instead of just 5 minutes, let's take 12 minutes, right? That's if there are admin people here, admin people would say that's more than 200% of the time that you had last time. So we'll do 12 minutes. But before that, 3 quick things. One is a reminder / encouragement, right? You remember the story of how the people of Israel are traveling in the desert and they're looking for food, right? And manna drops from heaven, right? As nice as it might feel to have a once and for all solution, God is often presented as being present in a way that is sufficient for each day. We are offered the gift of God's presence today, the gift of the now. Now, in our field of work, I imagine that's not the first time you're hearing something like that, right? So this is simply a reminder and encouragement. What might it mean for us to re-embrace the gift of presence in the time that we have now, right? That's just a word of encouragement. In the next 2 slides, I have 2 prompts. These are suggestions, folks. So if you find this exciting and you want to run with that, you can, but you don't need to. You can do something else that you think is important, something else that's brewing for you, and that's actually part of how a discussion should go. But here are 2 prompts, right? One is what we Christians believe about Christ's wounds has implications for our disposition towards the world, right? In other words, what we say about Christ's wounds affects how we deal with the wounds of the world. So what do you say? What do you say about Christ's wounds, right? So that's one prompt. The other prompt is, in your group, if you are so led, write a poem or psalm, right? This doesn't need to be too long, right? Think of this like a short psalm. And if you think of a short psalm, think of a shorter psalm, right? So write a poem or psalm that addresses a pastoral care situation you are encountering right now, right? It might not be what you encountered last week, but it might be something that you're encountering every now and then, something that's coming up for you as a need that you're encountering. And I'm using pastoral in the broader definition of the term, right? Any person who is offering care for others, right? So think about some situation that's emerging for you, a pastoral care situation, and write a poem or psalm that addresses it. And here, the only extra prompt here is listen to and register your emotions. Typo there. That's it's not a technical word. It's not a fancy word. It's only emotions. It's just my finitude that made me make the typo. So that's emotions. So just listen to and register your emotions, right? And write a poem or psalm. So that's it, folks. I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to just to quickly remind us of that again. These are suggestions. You can do whatever you like in your group, right? Something else that's brewing for you, something that you'd like to return to, a question that we did not sufficiently address. I know the last time, the second session kind of ended with you sharing. I didn't have any time to react or respond. If you want to return to some of those things, all of those things are possible. But let's take 12 minutes and come back and let's see what's brewing for us. You all did appear like popcorn, like Marilyn said, and this is a most wonderful popcorn here. So let's get started, folks. Let's do similarly like we did last time. Let's just go around. If you're reporting back from your group, just do so. And let's go around quickly and do that. And then we'll have some time for just open-ended conversation until about 11:55. That's a firm mark at which we'll stop, but we do have time until then. So let's do a quick round of our impressions. What's coming up for you? If you went with the prompt or something else is brewing, all are okay. So why don't I stop talking and you start, and whoever's ready, just go ahead.
The image of a suffering God is helpful in pastoring people with chronic pain. It helps build solidarity. The cross that is at the front of most of our churches is empty. We don't talk about it. So is there, why don't we talk about it? Is there healing that needs to be done around what the cross means? Or is it a representation of resurrection? And Anne Lamott's prayer, help, thanks, wow, seems to capture the poem that we were to compose.
Thank you, Louis. Let's take other groups whenever you're ready.
Our group hasn't spoken yet much, but we were responding to a few things. One is a reflection that our congregations, at least some of them, do struggle with the communal expression of negative emotions, right? That there is this, with the possible exception of a service that is in the Russian Mennonite community of Eternity Sunday, where we remember those who have died in the past year. That's a safe space or funerals, but otherwise we look to our communities to be strong places, and there's a concern about showing vulnerability or seeing vulnerability in these spaces. But there was a strong response in our group as well to Tasha, your statement that adoptive parents give strength to bear their kids to bear their primal wounds. And, how do we nurture that strength in our congregations? What is the fear and shame that we kind of carry around that? And in North America, our society teaches us to bear strength as individuals, right? But we can't bear our scars alone. So how do we send our congregations out, to bear one another's burdens together, right? How do we hold Good Friday in connection with Easter Sunday? And there was also at the end, we were talking about how do we channel our inner Desmond Tutu, right? In these days, the ability to carry joy and suffering together in a whole embodied, rich way.
Thank you, Kendall. That was great. Let's collect everyone's thoughts, folks. So whoever's ready, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Mary in Group 9, and we did speak briefly about COVID and some of our the decisions we made in interacting in face of what the rules are. But what I agreed to share was more personal, my personal question around earlier when about theologizing death. I had never ever thought about it that way, but in my own experience of being widowed very young and very suddenly, thinking about it here, theology would not have been helpful, to theologize it. It's just, I never thought about it in terms of theology. And years later, it would be much more helpful to sort of look at it, understand it differently. But at the time, what I needed more was just simply presence without advice.
In group one, we talked about the importance of not theologizing the suffering and death away, but being with people in those experiences and sharing their suffering with them, which is what compassion means. We were struck by the primal wound of a child losing home, family, and how can we be with people in the moment, in the wounds which they're suffering and experiencing. It reflected on we don't need to feel that we have to bring people to a certain place, but to just be with them and be aware of our own wounds and our own hurts as we're seeking to be helpful to others.
Thank you, Mary and Gary. Others?
Group 4. It's really interesting what's just being said about theological responses. And we felt the same thing, that we wondered, we didn't wonder, we felt that being there for someone without theological jargon or without trite phrases such as everything happens for a reason, that's not helpful. Then we also discussed anger, and we discussed it from the micro level and the macro level. And we felt that for people personally, it is more helpful to see it in terms of micro and not to feel guilty about that, because that's where we are and we don't need to feel guilty about that. And then there was also a discussion of anger in gender. So that was our discussion.
Thank you, Mara.
Group 5, we first of all, we found it a very rich morning, and there was a lot to think about. And so we want to acknowledge that we are really appreciating what we're getting this morning. We talked about thinking about Christ's wounds can change the way we pray. It can change the way we talk in our pastoral care meetings and in our caregiving, because we all carry wounds. And so thinking about our own woundedness and wondering if there are moments when we can be present with someone together in our woundedness. Like, do we have to have recovered ourselves before we can minister to others? Or are there moments when we can be together in our wounded state? And also, can we model our woundedness or our vulnerability? We talked about the sacred responsibility of sitting with people in a non-judgmental way to support them in their wounded state. And we talked about manna and the emphasis on not storing up for the future, which is countercultural for us, and focusing on getting what we need for today. And then at the end, we spoke briefly about the need to sometimes confront lovingly and how to address those times when people, they need to be reoriented in their thinking, how to do that in ways that are loving and non-judgmental, but not just saying yes, 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 and holding the hand.
Thanks, Nancy. That was great. Are there others who are yet to go?
We're in group 2. So we did talk about Christ's wounds post-resurrection, how they offer hope and understanding some of our own scars. And one of those scars that I had mentioned was the story of the doubting Thomas, doubting God's goodness in the midst of suffering, that there will come a day that you perhaps feel a little bit better or have more faith in what God's doing in the midst of that suffering. We talked about manna, provision for each day, life in God's presence, and with the help of others as well. And we talked about resources we have in the church And I guess Nancy mentioned some of that in prayer and outreach, just providing a space for healing to take place and being present to those in the midst of suffering. An interesting perspective was someone looked up the 5 holy wounds of Christ online. And of course, it has been a traditional part of worship is to look at Christ's wounds and to feel that emotion of suffering, more of an aesthetic worship that was experienced by the church through the Middle Ages and upwards. When we talked about pastoral care situations, someone in our group works with long-term care residents in a home. And we said, maybe we couldn't write a psalm or a poem, but some of the emotions that we would put into that psalm or poem are disappointment or time robbed from those who are going through that suffering, sense of despair, layers of loss. And people mention young adults even feeling that same loss of time. So it seems if we did write a poem, it would have something to do with time flying away without us knowing how to cope with that.
Thank you, Donna. Were there others? All right, thanks everyone. That was so rich. The time is 11:41, so we have 14 minutes. So let me let me propose this way forward. Let me react to 1 or 2 things and then just pause to see what's coming up for you. So by all means, if you want to respond to something others have said, you could do that, right? Maybe it's a good idea to keep your comments or questions short so that we can have other people also to have the opportunity to talk. I'm just going to say a quick thank you here to Donna for mentioning the words that could possibly go into a poem, right? So I'm hearing disappointment, I'm hearing how time has been robbed from us, the sense of despair that comes with that, and the layers of loss, right? Including loss of time and how to cope with all of those things. Those are all very, very crucial things, and they're real, they are felt. Right. I'll react to one more thing and I'll pause for now to see what else is coming up for you. I'm happy to respond to very particular things. Just say so, right? Just say, hey, I don't hear your response on this thing, and I will respond on those things, right? But I also want to acknowledge the general wisdom here that's floating around the room. So by all means, you can respond to each other as well. So let me just say this one thing for now, and then look to you for other thoughts, questions, comments. People, this has come up in more than one group about how presence is important, just vital, right? Presence without needing to say anything, without having to say anything. And that's perhaps the takeaway in what I was trying to get at when I say we should not be theologizing death and suffering, right? That we should not be in a position to use words to rationalize suffering, right? To offer some sort of reason, to offer some sort of rationale for, oh, maybe this happened because of this, or like some of you said, oh, maybe there's some good thing else is coming for you, or what's the other phrase that one of you used? I'm looking for the phrase here.
Everything happens for a reason.
Yes, thank you. That is such a commonly used phrase. And there might be some people who would make an argument saying that that's actually theologically sound, right? So what might it mean for us to actually poke at that a little bit and say, no, maybe that's not so theologically sound? As a matter of fact, maybe that's the problem. Maybe coming up with the theologically sound stuff is the problem. Maybe that is the problem, right? What might it mean for us to be present? And if we really are focusing on Jesus and Christ and Jesus's incarnation, isn't the incarnation all about presence, abiding presence, right? So let me stop there to see if there are other thoughts, comments, questions that are coming up for you.
And thank you so much just for all of the ways that you've helped to shape our thinking today. One of the pieces of your earlier presentation that really stood out to me is thinking about how the solidarity, hospitality of the Israelites is shaped by their experience of slavery. And so I shared this a little bit in my small group, but thinking about how do the stories, carrying the stories of who we were as a community, as individuals, and how we've experienced difficulties before shape how we understand this today. And, you know, the Bible scripture is one way of carrying those stories with us about what's shaped us. I've also been thinking about how does this experience of the pandemic, how is that shaping ways in which we might embody solidarity and hospitality going forward? And so thinking about this idea of the incarnated Christ who bears the scars is inspiring to me as we think about what might be the stories that we are developing, scars and all, that we carry with us into the church, the congregations, the communities that we are becoming.
Thanks, Leah, for saying that. That's a very, very insightful observation, right? That we are actually in a very unprecedented time. So your question about what might it mean for us to allow this pandemic, which is still ongoing, right, to shape us? What might it mean, right? I still remember the beginning months of the pandemic. You know, first it was just complete craziness, right? We just trying to figure out what's happening. And once we figured out what was happening, then we were at a place where we could say one or two things. And I remember there was a lot of talk about this is going to change how we live. It's an opportunity for us to reimagine and this and that. And now when we are in January 2022, I wonder whether we are just a bit too exhausted to think about those kinds of things. But it's still so important, so vital, right? Because I'm afraid that it might be another missed opportunity. I don't want it to be another missed opportunity, but I'm afraid that it might be, right? So what is the point if we allow every opportunity to be a missed opportunity and then we just return to the same old, right? So what the observation that you're making, Leah, is just very insightful. Don't let silence startle you, folks. If I'm silent, I can keep talking. I have no problem talking, but I also want to pause. But don't let my silence startle you. This is an opportunity for us to phrase, articulate what's on our mind and hearts here.
I think that your silence gives authenticity to your admonition not to theologize things. So we can just be silent, right? I appreciate your call for artistic expression, for writing a song, for poetry. Leah talked about what did the memory of slavery do in biblical literature. The memory of slavery is also what shaped Stephen Foster when he wrote that song, "Hard Times Come Again No More." And that song, "Hard Times," maybe we should write a song like that and remember it when we come out of the other end of this COVID. Stephen Foster's song has been covered 1,000 times and it's still in our minds. It's the song, "The Sigh of the Weary." But we remember it. And I think there's a Christian way to remember the grief that we are collectively experiencing.
That is another fantastic insight here. And from my brief journey with Mennonites here in Winnipeg, I know that Mennonites can compose and sing. So that is actually a really insightful observation with very, very concrete practical value there, right? This is possible. This is doable. This is within our means. It's a really good observation there.
When I think about Christ's abiding presence, and I think about his wounds, then I think about the fact that by our actions, I believe we can continue to wound him and even figuratively re-crucify him. I think we are accountable individually for and collectively for how we act, because God is, because he is present and because he is loving and because he is still real for us. We can still touch him, touch Jesus, affect his emotions, not only our emotions, but we can still make Jesus weep by what we do. When we commit, let's say a people commit genocide, I think that Jesus weeps.
Thank you, Heather, for saying that. There's a theologian by the name Ignacio Ellacuría, and he has this notion of crucified peoples. And essentially, it's pointing to the kind of thing that you're pointing to, right, Heather? That we continue to wound each other. And that is a way of actually crucifying Jesus, re-crucifying Jesus. What might it mean for us to pay attention to those who are crucified in our own time also, right? So this is a really good observation there. Thanks for saying that.
I just wanted to make a quick mention of the dark night of the soul mentioned by St. John of the Cross. Because I've often turned to that poem, The Dark Night, to remember that we're on a journey towards that mystical union with Christ. And it seemed to fit in here, so just wanted a quick mention that.
Yes, for sure, Donna. Thank you for mentioning that. This is the kind of sense that we get, right? That there are situations where it's just things too terrible to even name, right? All we can do is sigh sometimes. That's a good thing to name there. In the 2 minutes that we have left, let me see if anybody else wants a reaction or a response on anything. I think we might have time for one last question or comment. I want to maybe make this last comment then. I'll say two things, right? I'll say two things. One is, some of you are pointing to already existing practices, right? So for instance, one of you in your groups came back and said something like, when there's a funeral procession, right? There's a way in which we stop to acknowledge the moment. And then you also said you're increasingly noticing that's no longer happening to the same extent. There's a way in which we just keep moving, we just keep going and going, right? Examples like that are just powerful, right? It allows us to think about how death and suffering and loss that actually binds us all, right? We all have suffered loss in different ways. So loss is something that could actually bind us rather than set us apart. And yet it becomes a way in which things are set apart rather than bringing us together, right? So what might it mean for us to think about loss as engendering that binding force? What might it mean for us to think about concrete practices like that and reimagine, retell, redo, right? Those kinds of things. Those are all great. And the second thing I want to say is you are just a fantastic bunch of people. You are thoughtful, you are insightful, you're wise. And I'm not saying that as an element of surprise here. I was telling Marilyn, I'm not surprised by that. I am not surprised by that, but I'm just delighted by it. And maybe the one word of encouragement that I'll offer here before turning the mic over to Marilyn and Catherine is just let's continue to think about these things in a present continuous mode, right? If there's a tense into which we can live, that's probably a good tense to live into, a present continuous mode. Not something we've done in the past to look back and say, yeah, we did that in 2022. But what might it mean for us to do it in a present continuous way? Thanks, folks. This was a great, great conversation. It's time for me to hand over the mic. You'll still see my face until we close, but I'm going to hand over the mic for now.
I'll just hop in with a couple of logistical things. So one of the things I wanted to point out to all of you that you can check this and a lot of more out on our MCEC website with under Learning Commons. And there will be recording made available, as well as John offered to make the slides to us available as well as book suggestions. We will all sort of try and post that together. So make note of that, you know, there's some opportunity for continuous learning there as well. And I'll pass it over to Marilyn from here on.
All right. Thanks, Catherine. I want to acknowledge all the work that Catherine did in setting up and organizing the Pastors, Chaplains, Congregational Leaders event, as well as all the Learning Commons events. Catherine's leadership in this area has been really wonderful for us. So thanks, Catherine. And Al, for your behind the scenes tech work as well. John, I am not surprised how delightful this morning has been. I trusted Irma, who also had talked to me about you and said, you have to get John to come to MCEC. He's amazing. And you have been, John. Thank you for your, just your gracious, joyful presence with us, your hospitality with us. There is so much to take away. And when you all were at breakout groups, we were chatting amongst us with John, and I said, "Oh, good food for thought." And then I said, "Actually, it's food for action." So your invitation for us has been for us to embody, to register our emotions and give them the weight and the attention and the intention that they deserve, so that they can lead us towards action rather than inaction, paralysis and inaction. So I thank you for that and for embodying that this morning for us. For leading us, I think you cared for us and you helped us register our emotions as you began your second presentation by helping us just remember and sit with the emotions from this difficult time. And they come very easily for some of us. So thank you. I would like to close our time together with another one of Jan Richardson's blessings for us from this book, the cure for sorrow, which comes out of her own journey of grief and becoming a widow very suddenly and unexpectedly. And so here is her blessing of hope. So may we know the hope that is not just for someday, but for this day, for now. Here, now, in this moment that opens to us. Hope not made of wishes, but of substance. Hope made of nephesh and muscle and bone. Hope that has breath and a beating heart. Hope that will not keep quiet and be polite. Hope that knows how to holler when it is called for. Hope that knows how to sing when there seems little cause. Hope that raises us from the dead. Not someday, but this day, every day, again and again and again. May you go with this kind of hope, all of you, all of us, into this day and our walk of faith with those who suffer, which includes us. May we register, engage, and act. Blessings.